So I saw a post recently where a woman was saying that she participated in intimate acts with a man at a club because he told her he would pay for her rent. So in other words, prostitution. And she was openly admitting this in a very casual setting. It wasn't her account or anything. And I looked in the comments because I knew I would find this one comment. Somebody said it did not fail. Somebody said, BRB converting to Islam. I don't know if you've noticed, but every time something especially depraved like that starts making its rounds on social media, people will comment, BRB converting to Islam, or where do I sign up for Islam? Now, obviously this is an exaggerated situation, so it's just meant as sort of a joke, it's sort of meant in jest, but at the same time, there's a lot of truth to it. I think the average person is becoming very exhausted with the level of depravity society has reached. I think people are sick of being told that wrong is right and right is wrong. And I think that people have finally decided or finally realized that traditional values aren't so bad. People think that Islam is so bad for women, and they're shocked to find out that most people who convert to Islam are women. But the reality is, Western society is terrible to women. It treats us like garbage, it works us to the bone, and gives us absolutely no value except for how we look. That's why so many women, including myself, have embraced Islam and are living fulfilled lives because of it.
I looked at the things that were holding me back and said, Allahu Akbar, God is greater than the things that are holding me back.
What were just a couple of the things that were holding you back?
I looked at everything else that life could give me, and I didn't really need alcohol. I didn't need other things that the West was making available for me to consume. Something that does face men is this fetishization of women. Desire to do whatever one wants to women unhindered, without any kind of responsibility.
Oh,
this is deeply embedded in us.
So you just hit a spot. I was just listening to someone the other day also, and in an interview, and he was saying the same thing. This is a well-known personality, and he was saying, look, he was kind of insinuating that he still wants to play with the ladies.
Well, it's very profound, and it's very deeply embedded in men. It's one of the, it's pre-alcohol, whatever it is you might have taken before becoming Muslim. It's a deeply embedded one that comes in through Hollywood predominantly. And you could say in some ways it's the heightening of desire for the opposite sex. It's a heightening of that. It's brought into an unnatural thing. Nowadays, people don't even want to say they've got a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That's how much they shun this idea of having any formalities to the relationship.
Yeah.
They don't want any formalities to a relationship. They want this, and they might well stay together for decades, but they don't want this label. They might say it's my partner. They don't want to say boyfriend or girlfriend. And when I grew up, it was kind of like you say, I'm seeing somebody. I'm seeing her. What it meant, it was your girlfriend. But you wouldn't ever want to say girlfriend because that was too serious, let alone wife. So this unhindered desire, this unrestrained element of attraction that's been put in our heads. There was other desires I had to overcome. I realized that was the last one, and it's deeply ingrained in men.
My rule for myself was no more sex casually, because you get attached to a guy when that happens, and whether you want to or not, and not if you're drinking. Now, if you still drink, have all the casual sex you want, because you're not present for it, so your body doesn't form as much of a bond. Now I don't drink anymore, so when I have sex, it's like my body thinks I'm making a baby with this guy, and then the next day you're like going crazy, and now my body thinks I love him, and then I can't get any work done because I'm worried about him not watching my Instagram story or whatever it is. And I really feel like it throws me off as a human being and depresses me. A lot of emotional turmoil comes with sex for me, and so I was like, no more sex. And this guy didn't really mean anything to me. He's already been so mean to me, but but I'd already hooked up with him, so the comfort level was there. The next day, I'm like, why isn't he it got in. It got in.
Of course.
And with him also, it was the holding my hand walking down the hallway after he walked me to the elevator, not even to the lobby, just the elevator. Holding my hand, it's like a very intimate thing that men do on first dates that sends the wrong message to women. And they're doing it because they want you they want to they don't know they're doing this, but men, you hold our hands on first dates not because you want to be our boyfriend. Sometimes that's the case where you feel like close to us and you want to show that, but it is to develop a false sense of security so that you can get later on that night. And it's not nice. Stop holding our hands on first dates unless you want to be our boyfriend. Stop it, because that is a thing that when a woman gets her hand held, it's a very cherished feeling that you feel.
It is.
I don't hold hands with a lot of men, so when a man holds my hand, it is like. And if we're talking the hold hand like this, where it's like palm to palm and it's like a loose one,
but
that's better than a
interlocked.
Because I've been making out with this guy and I thought, oh, making out, who cares? Making out is making out.
Right.
But even him, I'm like, I think about him all the time. I'm like, why did he only like my fire emoji that I just sent to him?
Right.
Why didn't he write back a fire emoji to me? Like I'm analyzing these things.
Was there a time when it wasn't so emotional? Like you could be with guys and
when I drank.
Yeah.
Because I would get blackout drunk and I wouldn't remember the intimacy that had occurred.
Right.
And so I was really just free in my 20s to sleep around and I wasn't remembering any of the sex. So I wasn't actually like having that fun of sex, but at least I was getting it in.
What made you shift to not drink?
Because everyone whose careers I admired didn't drink. And I was like, there's something to this. And I have alcoholism in my family and all of my sex was based on getting wasted enough to be able to have sex. And I was like, if I ever want a real relationship that isn't, every time I had sex, I had to get drunk. I remember one morning waking up with this guy that we had gotten wasted the night before, had sex. And the next day we were to hang out all day. And he didn't have alcohol in his apartment and he didn't want to go drink and he wanted to have sex again. And I was just like, well, no, how? Well, no.
How's that going to work?
But of course I had to, because I'm like, I did it last night. Why wouldn't I want to today?
Right.
And so then you just feel like sober sex in the morning after a hookup when the guy is like, you were into it last night.
Yeah.
It's just the worst sex because you're almost raping yourself with him. You're raping, you're allowing it to happen. He doesn't know. He thinks you're down. You were down last night.
Yeah.
He didn't know I was blackout.
Yeah.
In her new book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, she explains from a socio-evolutionary perspective why today's liberal hookup culture is actually bad for women. And as a modern secular feminist herself, she's come to some surprisingly traditional conclusions around marriage and relationships. So today we'll be asking whether post-Christendom is a brave new world or a culture in collapse.
Yes, I went to university, I studied anthropology, I studied women's studies. I then worked in a rape crisis centre afterwards. It was a real confrontation with reality. Looking at the gap between what I was experiencing during frontline work and what I had been taught as feminist theory shook my faith in feminist theory irreversibly, as it turned out. Actually, the first domino to fall in terms of bringing me to the point where I wrote a book called The Cases Against the Sexual Revolution was to do with the trans movement. It was a very, very hot button issue when I was at university. It was very, 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 very difficult to express any public skepticism about the claims of trans activists. I privately began to have my doubts. So a premise that I start with, which is a very controversial premise in feminist land, but is probably less so in the rest of the world, is that men and women are fundamentally different in some very important ways. And some of those differences are physical, and some of those differences are psychological. And the psychological differences are average ones, and there are outliers, but they are nevertheless real, and they're important at the population level. So, for instance, men are higher in a term that psychologists call sociosexuality, which is one's desire for sexual variety, essentially, a drive towards having
multiple partners,
casual
novelty,
sex and so on. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which no one, I think, should be surprised to hear, because that obviously should sort of hold true in our experience of the world, but it's just very, very difficult to say in progressive circles where the blank slate doctrine dominates. Women have been encouraged, not by conspiracy generally, but by a new kind of culture, a new kind of incentive structure to imitate male sexuality, to imitate that more unrestricted sociosexuality. So hookups, so watching porn, so experimenting with fetishes, all these things which suit the interests of people who are naturally more sexually adventurous, but don't, I think, suit the interests of the vast majority of women who are not naturally that way inclined, but are encouraged, I think, to see that as aspirational.
Because it's purportedly a liberating kind of form of sexuality. That's
exactly, and the only reason that you wouldn't want to do those things is because you still had hang-ups,
Right.
you know, derived from the old
So
traditions.
the book, as I say, comes to, in a sense, some surprisingly traditional conclusions in that sense, essentially saying by the end chapter, well, perhaps we need to reconsider going back to what we had before the sexual revolution, the idea of monogamous marriage. I mean, that's a pretty stark kind of conclusion to reach. How's that been received by people,
A lot of my critics
by your
agree.
peers?
Yes, so a common view among feminist friends and colleagues who've read the book is they love it right up until the last chapter where I make the case for monogamous marriage. But I mean, what I try to do in that chapter, it is the controversial chapter, is to make that argument in entirely secular terms and to use as much data as it is much more instructive to use the word feminist in a very loose sense, just to mean any sort of campaign on behalf of women. So I think it's perfectly plausible that mainstream feminism in this country could move rightwards, and I think probably is moving rightwards. A view that I've had expressed to me quite often from liberal feminists is that the problem with the sexual revolution is that we never finished it, we never fully accomplished it, that the project was all about liberating ourselves, and we are not yet liberated, and that's why people are in pain, and so we need to just sort of continue the project right to the very end of the long dusty road, and that any attempts to roll back that freedom project would be a mistake. I mean, so where I differ on that is I think that actually the project was fundamentally misconceived from the beginning, and we are seeing the inevitable consequences of throwing freedom at a society that is in denial about the nature of sexual difference.
You say so powerfully in this book that the whole sexual revolution has been a boon for caddish men, for the Hugh Hefner types. You know, and so, but it's justified by contemporary liberal feminists as being something beneficial for women. But in fact, those who have benefited the most are the ones who have the most contempt for women.
Yeah. We have basically run an experiment of 60 odd years on the sexual revolution. We've seen it play out now, and you know, many of these people will be the children of broken homes, have been exposed to online porn from the age of 10, 11.
The idea of not having a sexual relationship before you marry would just seem mind-bogglingly bizarre and primitive to many people today.
Yes.
So is there anything you can do to kind of push back on that narrative if you honestly think that actually people have got that the wrong way around?
There's a plot line where one of the characters decides not to have sex with a boyfriend who she then becomes engaged to as a sort of experiment. She's obviously not a virgin, but, you know, and then it comes to the night before their wedding, and she discovers that he's impotent, and it ends up destroying the marriage. It doesn't last very long. This is the nightmare scenario presented to people for whom the idea of not having premarital sex is bizarrely old-fashioned. The pill was this radical transformation, which I don't think we've ever really come to terms with. I don't think that we've properly grappled with it on a social level at all. I think it is extremely likely that we will have new technology shocks, that we will have new transformations of society. I mean, COVID was one little taste of what might come from a world in which we are vulnerable to disease in ways that we have got used to not being vulnerable to. If we enter a post-antibiotic world, which is a very serious threat, that will have completely transformative social effects. There will be no more sex parties and prostitution, and, you know, in a world where we have antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea, which we already have. You know, this is just one example of ways in which our material circumstances could change very suddenly. And I think in those circumstances, it is plausible that we might return to some of the most durable ideologies. If you look at the data, the class skew on marriage is absolutely incredible. In this country, also in the States and in other places. You get a liberal elite who tend to talk negatively about marriage and are opposed to marriage incentives in policy making and so forth, but they are actually the group of people who are most likely to themselves get married and stay married. If you've heard the expression luxury belief, an idea which confers status on rich people and harms poor people, the anti-marriage sexual revolution idea is a really great example of a luxury belief, because it's deeply unfashionable on the left to talk about marriage being a force for good, but actually people in elite positions who are wealthier upper middle classes for themselves love marriage and are the group most likely to choose it for themselves and wish it for their children and so on. They're just reluctant to prescribe it for the rest of society, which actually disproportionately harms poorer people.